Welcome, Anne, again to the Femsplainers. So happy to see you again. Well, you were on just very recently. You were on like a month ago. So it's co-splaining.
Yes, we were on. Yes, a few weeks ago
with Emily St. John Mandel talking about pandemics. But
that's correct.
We've talked a little bit about the book, David and I, before you came on. But just give us, a quick summary of it and what moved you to write it, because of course, among other things, it's much shorter than many of your other books. It's maybe the thinnest book.
Indeed. I mean, so, to date, the history books that I write involve spending many years in archives, collecting lots of facts, putting them together into a narrative. Sometimes that takes many years, showing a story from different points of view, looking at it from the, whether it's the Gulag, from the prisoner's point of view, from Stalin's point of view, and so on. This book is exactly the opposite of that. So this is a very personal book. I make clear that I have a set of biases. This is my point of view on events that happened over the last 10 and 20 years. It really started with, it really did start the way the book starts. In other words, it started with me thinking back on a New Year's Eve party that I gave in 1999, which I have a feeling both of you were in fact invited to.
We were.
Made the mistake of not
coming. We still are huge regrets that we were unable to get to Poland in January.
we have
That's
been to
right. Well, many people felt that. Anyway, it was not a fancy party. It was quite a scruffy party in many ways. But what I reflected on 20 years later was how many of the people who were at it were no longer my friends. And there were one or two in particular who puzzled me. And I started to think about what were the things that had changed, what had altered in politics, what had altered in the world that meant that, and the party is a metaphor. Okay, this is not a book about parties. It's about who are your alliances and who are you allied to in politics, and whose team do you feel you're on at one point in history, and how come that changes at another point in history. And the team that I was on, in 1989 and the 1990s and all the way up to 1999 was a team that I felt were kind of, I would describe them broadly as center-right anti-communists. So in Poland, these were people who'd been in the opposition. We were the younger members of the opposition, actually. So these aren't necessarily leaders of the opposition, in the anti-communist opposition, I should say, in the previous years. In the US and the UK, they were also people who were anti-communists. They were center-right. You might have called us free marketeers at that time, although I don't think economics was the driving inspiration. You might have called us classical liberals. You might have, some of the British ones, you might have called them Thatcherites. You might have called the Americans Reaganites. Anyway, it felt to me like a single group. And the party, which was mostly Poles and sort of, ranging from friends of ours, journalists from Warsaw, Radek's cousins, my husband's cousins, plus a few foreigners, was that group of people, or that was what unified them. And it felt at the time like a solid group. Okay, then as I fast forward to the present, certainly if you look at the polls, a chunk of the people who were there are now not just, it's important to understand that these are journalists and intellectuals. They are really the thinkers and spin doctors and creators of the current Polish ruling party, which is a nativist nationalist party. Just to give you a little flavor of the kind of rhetoric they use, they just won a presidential election, although it was very close. And the central theme of the election campaign was, and this is the president's, the sitting president's language, LGBT, a word that sounds very strange in Polish because it's an English acronym. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the threat of LGBT, and he said, LGBT is not people, it's an ideology, and it's an ideology worse than communism. That was a part of his campaign. Another part of the campaign was an attempt to show his opponent, who's the mayor of Warsaw, as someone who answers to foreign and especially Jewish masters. We don't really know if he's really Polish. And the messaging of the campaign was to create the sense that we are the real Poles, and to underline this division in Poland. We're the Poles; those are the foreigners, the outsiders. They're somehow unpatriotic traitors. And I have friends who are part of that messaging, or people that I know. I wouldn't say they're my friends, but or people who I know who engage in that messaging, take part in it, are happy to make anti-Semitic references in public television and in election campaigns. And so the question is, what happened to those people? Were they always like that, or did they change? And the book goes through that same answer, looks at that same kind of question from several different angles. So I talk about my British friends who at that time were also, as I said, Thatcherites. Many of them are now leading Brexiteers, including Boris Johnson, who was a journalist colleague, also in the 1990s. I look a little bit at Americans. I focus on someone who's not a close friend of mine, but whom I did know and was kind of generally in my circle. And of course, you both know very well, Laura Ingraham. And I look also at Spain, which is, again, not a country that I am, as deeply involved in, but where where you can also trace a similar process. And the book looks both at people, and it looks at some historical echoes of these changes. And there's a bit of reporting. There are people whom I interview and so on. And it looks for an explanation, and there isn't a single explanation. And so for political scientists, it's going to be a very annoying book. There isn't a kind of grand thesis that I proclaim and that you can argue with in an easy way. In fact, the book is quirky enough that my American publishers and my British publishers had a big fight over what the title should be. And the title, which is Twilight of Democracy, which not everybody liked, but the truce was that the subtitles are different. So the American title is Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, and the British title is Twilight of Democracy, The Failure of Politics and the Parting of Friends. And those do sound quite different. And that's because those are two aspects of the book. So part of the book is about the lure of authoritarianism, why it's attractive to some people, and part of the book is about the failure of politics and the parting of friends. I should say you are both in the book, so maybe we should
but we're
make
still
clear
friends, right? Spoiler alert, we're still friends. What happened to Danielle and David?
That's right. They drove north of the border and were never seen again, except this giant ice sculpture. Winter set in.
No, and I should also say that most of the people whom I was friends with 20 years ago, I'm still friends with. So it's not like I lose all my friends. One of the reviews also had a line, because I also end the book on a party, just again as a kind of metaphor. And somebody said, well, she's still having parties, but the guest list is a lot shorter. No, it's the same length guest list. It's just different people. It's really looking at the alteration in, the changes of political configuration, particularly on the center right, that have taken place over the last 3 decades.
Well, I wanted to bookend that wonderful summary with the story of another party, which was in October 2017, a book party that we had for you that was cited in an article about you that appeared in GQ by Sam Tannenhouse. And one of the striking things is the guest list, it wasn't any shorter, it was just radically different. And Sam noted that there are a lot of people there who would not have been there 10 years ago. And there are a lot of people who weren't there who would have been there 10 years ago.
And this is sort of more liberal, quote unquote, than conservative.
Right, because one of the things that is also a sub-theme of your book is our friends change, the world changed, but we also change. Everything changes, and that the experiences of the past, of the most recent past, have driven us to places where we didn't think we would be.
That's absolutely true. The issues that you and I have had this conversation, I think, that things that wouldn't have interested me or wouldn't have bothered me much, or I didn't care that much about, or I didn't see the point of. For example, like LGBT rights, which wasn't in the front of my agenda 10 or 15 years ago, I've come to see as actually quite crucial and quite critical because of the way they've been manipulated and used by people whom I think are doing it for the wrong reasons and are doing it in a divisive way. And the change of circumstances has also meant that issues look differently in the light of time, and that's that's normal. David, I think you were the one who pointed me also, and this is in the book, to this fantastic phenomenon that's described in Marcel Proust's famous, very, very long novel, in which he also talks about, there's a point in the novel where he talks about the Dreyfus trial, which is another sub-theme in my book. And how everybody, all the parties in Paris are, there's a political division that's created. People who are pro and anti-Dreyfus. Dreyfus is a famous case of a French army officer who was wrongly accused of having been a traitor, and he was Jewish, and there was a big burst of anti-Semitism washed over Paris, and eventually some people began to defend him, and he was eventually brought back and pardoned and so on. But this caused great divisions, political divisions and social divisions. And then in the final volume of the series, the narrator comes back to Paris and discovers that these bitter divisions that the Dreyfus years had evoked had somehow melted away, and the divisions had recast themselves. And now the First World War had happened, and people found themselves on different sides. Events had made people seek different alliances. So this is nothing unique to our time or to our society.
Yeah.
Well, let's put some names to this so people can sort of see it in a more personal way. You mentioned Laura Ingraham, but let's talk about Tucker Carlson, because Tucker was someone who used to come to our parties. He was a colleague of yours at the Weekly Standard back in the day.
Well, we don't literally live in Georgetown, but when Tucker was inveighing on one of his shows about Georgetown cocktail parties, someone we both knew said, "That's weird, because the one and only time I ever met Tucker Carlson was at a cocktail party at David Frum's house." And as I say, it's not literally Georgetown, but it's about
it's like a mile north.
It's about a mile north. Right, but I have this joke. I mean, I have this joke that is maybe a little sharper than I should tell, but I should say, I really liked Weimar Tucker. The new Tucker, I'm not so sure about, but the Weimar era version was very charming.
Let's describe him. You see, so I remember he came to one of our annual holiday parties. He was a
product of the same. So his father ran American broadcasting into the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. His father had been a well-known journalist, and he became then head of that entity that runs Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and so absolutely a product of those anti-communist struggles. And Tucker, the family was very well off. Tucker was expensively educated, and belonged to that world, came into the Weekly Standard, where he was a really, really good magazine writer, wrote other kinds of magazine pieces. I think I blurbed his first book. And in the early 2000s, but he loved TV. And another mutual friend of ours, Christopher Hitchens, used to warn him against this, the way you might warn off someone from cocaine. Or, it's seductive, it's lucrative, it's dangerous. Yeah. And then, but he kept trying it and failing at it and trying it and failing at it. And then finally he found the formula that worked. And what I think about him, there's in Richard Rovere's biography of Joe McCarthy, he tells this story that Rover, I never know how to pronounce his name, had been a journalist who'd covered McCarthy closely. And McCarthy was kind of a raffish, if you got to know him, he was actually kind of fun to be around. He was sort of raffish. He told dirty stories. And McCarthy and Rovere's wife had also liked Joe McCarthy a fair bit, against her, and despised everything he was doing, but couldn't help but be engaged with him. And he came home and found his wife very, very upset. And she had just heard on the radio that Joe McCarthy had died. And the announcer, looking for something to say positive about the recently dead, said, McCarthy, he was a controversial figure, loved by some, hated by many, but whatever else you have to say about him, at least he was sincere. And the wife said, don't they understand, the one thing you could never say about him was that he was sincere. It wasn't that he didn't believe it, is that he didn't care whether he believed it or not. I think when I watched, Tucker would, if animal rights were the formula for Fox News' survival as a business, he would be for animal rights. Unfortunately, if it was in Poland and anti-Semitism was the secret of success, he would be for that. If being pro LGBT was the key.
Can we have the Q? They seem to have dropped the Q in Poland.
It must sound weird. It must sound super weird in Polish.
I just noticed in Poland the Q doesn't exist. Sorry, go on.
No, that we don't know what the Q means in Poland.
But,
we don't know. I mean, we don't. LGBT doesn't make any sense in Polish either. I should say. It's like what, it's a weird acronym. So,
but we have, and so one of the he raises this question, which is one of the is the people you talk about, the people we know. You can divide them between those who believe it and those who don't, between the fanatics and the crooks. And it's kind of the fanatics and the cynics. And if they go to work in the White House, they become crooks. And it's kind of a complicated moral question. Which are worse, the people who believe it or the people who don't?
Yes. I mean, and in my book, they're both. I mean, there are, there are people who, I mean, this is a concept that I tried to tease out. There are people who are, I believe, people on the right who are genuinely despairing about the state of modern culture, and who really do believe that it's degraded, that our societies are divided. They are degenerate. Whether for some it's sexually degenerate, for some it's the too rapid demographic change. For some people, it's the influence of global capitalism, and even people on the right, that the family is disappearing. Small towns are losing their appeal. In England, a lot of it's about the countryside. The countryside is losing its traditional look. And one of the people, for example, that I write about in the book, and this is somebody who I believe to be extremely sincere. I mean, and I quote from a very powerful book he wrote called England and Elegies, because Roger Scruton, who's a really great, probably the greatest conservative philosopher in Britain in the last several decades, and who was genuinely despairing. So he wrote a book called England and Elegy, which he describes as a funeral oration for my society. In other words, England is dead, and cannot be revived. And then the book describes this Englishness, which has been lost. And I think he's someone who sincerely felt that. I don't doubt that. He was also not a politician. He was not a spin doctor or a journalist. He was not a Tucker Carlson. But I do think that his sincerity, was something that was real. So people and other people felt this, that some kind of society was disappearing. And then there are other insincere people, opportunists, who leap on these deeper feelings and seek to manipulate them, and whether it's as Tucker Carlson does in order to get a job on Fox or to make his program the most watched television, show on cable TV, or whether it's people who seek to create a political party based on, this sense of disorientation that people have, which is to do with modernity and rapidly changing technology and so on. So then there are people who manipulate these deeper sentiments. But maybe Laura Ingraham is one who is worth bringing up. So I do talk about her in the book. She's someone who I do not know well, but I know some people who know her. And she's someone who I think probably is sincere, or at least a portion of what she does is sincere, and that she's somebody who does feel that America's degenerate, that the wrong elite is in power, that the people who run, most governments and most universities, she talks a lot about the left, the Dems, universities all being a kind of a single interchangeable group. And she thinks they shouldn't be in charge, whatever in charge means, given that they're not in charge. It's a strange, but I think at some level, of course, she's also somebody who has, thanks to the Trump administration, has got a primetime slot on Fox, which she didn't have before. So she's a beneficiary of this new wave of American nationalism. But also at some level, I think she believes it, or she believes that there is a real threat to America coming from rioters in Portland. But maybe you disagree. Actually, you all know her better than I do.
Well, she has been a very, very good friend of ours for many, many years. And when Trump happened, we've drifted apart. But I think what you're saying is interesting, that it's almost like, I don't know, we're looking at different sides of a looking glass, that those, and we have other friends, I think, who for religious because of their religious beliefs, for all the things you said, don't like Trump, but they prefer him to, or will accept him just in order not to have the other side in power. Because it's not to say that, you know, what happened in Portland isn't scary, that radicals and activists on all sides are always scary. But I guess, what is it in you that makes one side scarier than the other, and therefore willing to say, well, Trump may have many flaws, but, you know, at least he's getting the right judges, and blah, blah, blah.
Well, this takes the question of the Harper's letter that has been so controversial. I want to get back to our friends in a minute, but one of the things that I
explain what the Harper's letter is too.
So about 150 writers, academics, intellectuals, and you were one, I was another, signed a letter that was organized by a core group whose names are not germane for the moment. So we're going to protest.
Thomas Chatterton Williams. George Packer,
George Packer, to raise a voice of protest against some recent events, mostly on the American liberal left, where people who had said or done something that was not consistent with the latest trends in liberal left thought found themselves losing jobs, being forbidden to speak, punished in various kinds of ways that were that went beyond criticism, but actually attacks on people's livelihoods. Attacks on people's ability to belong to institutions they had belonged to. And I'm not on the liberal left, obviously, and I had complicated feelings about that letter, because one of the things I've noticed is which of these dangers that Danielle alluded to rate first. A lot depends on, as always, where you are. So if you're in a university, if you're in an American corporation with an active HR department,
activist HR department.
You can feel Trump is far away. The threat of right-wing authoritarianism is far away. Meanwhile, you are being hauled into a re-education class where your family's livelihood, it's your family's subsistence in the face of this terrible economic crisis depends on your willingness to repeat dogmas that you find untrue. But if you don't repeat the dogmas, you'll lose your job. And people find that very threatening. Then those of us who are not in that situation say, this sounds like, yes, this is, if you were on a campus, this is very annoying, but meanwhile, the fundaments of the American Constitution and the World Trading System and the Western World Order, all of those are under attack. I can add maybe a personal note, which is the one time in my life that I was ever canceled, it was from a right-wing institution, not a left-wing one.
Well, let me maybe ask, sorry, Anne, I would maybe on that, react to that, but also a question for both of you is, why don't you react to these left-wing so-called threats? Like, what is it about you and Anne that are not more upset in the way that maybe under Reagan, when you would be more reactive to a lot of things that would be lumped in the leftist or Democratic bracket that just don't seem to bug or scare you as much anymore, and thus gives the friends who are worried about it a kind of mystification of why don't you care, but why aren't you more bothered? But maybe, Anne, you answer that.
So I mean, part of it for me, so I live in Europe, and it's, as David said, I'm not in a university or actually a news organization where this is a constant presence or problem. All of my dealings with American undergraduates, which have been more recently, I've been involved at Johns Hopkins University, have been overwhelmingly positive in the sense that they all seem very open and unideological. And so, I feel it's awkward for me to comment on a sort of situation that I don't have any direct knowledge of. I mean, I can read about it in the newspapers. Whereas my involvement and understanding and knowledge of the authoritarian and nationalist right is very direct and personal. I feel it around me. I see it all the time. I know the people. And so that feels like something I'm able to talk about more. There's also a big difference between, we're talking about the difference between people in power and people out of power. The damage that the authoritarian, Republicans have done by being in charge of the United States over the last 3 years seems to me so overwhelming and so terrifying that for me, the priority has to be to focus on having a change. I mean, by the way, not only a change of president, but also a change within that party. It's very important that America has a conservative party which is decent and well run, and run by upstanding moral people who care about the United States, and that it isn't a corruption racket for a family or a group of lobbyists. And so I very much hope that the Republican Party will be saved. But if you look at the way the party behaves, whether you look at the voter suppression tactics, the attempts to make sure that people have difficulty voting, which is, by the way, about to be a huge issue coming up in the fall. The gerrymandering, the lying, the attacks on nonpartisan and bipartisan institutions. Whether it's the FBI and the CIA or judges or the media. The constant attempt to undermine people's trust in institutions that are really necessary to our society. I mean, these seem to me such huge and terribly damaging efforts that, my effort has been focused on that. Whereas so far, these arguments that the left-wing arguments inside university, the emergence of this illiberal left-wing ideology that insists people speak a certain way about race and about gender. That seems to me something that, first of all, it's been mostly up until now fairly fringe, and it doesn't even affect most universities, and it doesn't affect most kids at most universities. You can dodge this issue completely if you're a chemical engineering major. And most of this has seemed focused on a small group of kids. I mean, I also tend to think that as it moves into the mainstream, as we've seen over the last few weeks, as it moves into newspapers and maybe corporate HR departments, I do think that the pushback against it will begin to be larger. I mean, even in just the last kind of 3 weeks, there have been critiques of this Robin DiAngelo book, which is full of this sort of nonsense about almost kind of racist discussion of racism, about what Black people are and what white people are. I mean, you're beginning to see really good criticism of that appearing. And I sort of feel like this ideology will eventually fall apart. Once we defeat Trump and once we have a Republican Party which speaks for conservative American values, I'll be happy to join in with that. I mean, of course, I agree with it. It's hard for me to see it as the biggest threat to the world right now. I don't know, David, how do you feel?
I agree with everything you've said. I would add a couple of things to it. First, an anecdote. I have a friend who had an important job on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and he attended a number of focus groups with working class Democrats, exactly the kind of people whom Hillary Clinton so devastatingly and crucially lost in 2016. And again, the issue that would come up, especially among the women, was political correctness. And he struggled. What are they talking about? They're not on a university campus. They don't work in media organizations. And he gradually understood that what these women were saying is there is this new upper class etiquette about how to speak about certain things that is constantly changing. We never understood it round one, but if we ever did understand it, they changed the rules again. And one of these days, my husband is going to make a joke in the fire hall or in the construction, and he's going to lose his job, and our family is going to be ruined because some upper class person, fancy education, said your husband's joke is a firing offense, and it was almost like a form of class tyranny over them, and maybe they exaggerated in their minds how real this threat was, but they really did experience it. So something important is going on here. And it also blocks, as we saw on this broadcast 2 weeks ago, that there's this new identification of people with this problem of gender dysphoria, strongly feeling that they don't belong in their bodies. And this raises a lot of scientific and psychological and medical questions, but instead there is now this brute attempt to decide it by political power and intimidation. where the doctors who know most about it are precisely those who are not allowed to speak about it because they might say the wrong thing.
Oh, indeed, are getting removed from their posts.
Yeah, so that's an important but boutique issue. I think one of the other reasons I would say with Anne, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything you said about why it seems. I mean, President of the United a malign president of the United States is a bigger problem than a weak president of Yale. And at the moment, we seem to have both. And I wish we had a less weak president of Yale, and I wish we had a less malign president of the United States. But if I'm given only one wish, I'm going to choose for a less malign president of the United States over a less weak president of Yale. But I think there's a last thing that is going on, which is, as Anne said, this is a dynamic discussion. And I'm not sure it's a totally sinister discussion, because as the discussion unfolds, there are things where you have to say, actually, you kind of make a point. I mean, it is insane that the U.S. Army has bases named for Confederate generals. And I always thought that was a weird, I mean, ever since I became aware of it, I always thought that was...
I didn't even know it was true. I had no idea there were bases named for Confederate generals. I just didn't know that, General Bragg was a Confederate general. So
right, exactly.
It didn't register in my...
And then you don't think about it much. And then someone draws your attention to it, and you say, yeah, no, that shouldn't happen. That's obvious. And
ridiculous. Yeah.
And then other things too that people draw your attention to, I can walk past a statue of Stonewall Jackson with a shrug and say, weird that somebody would build that, but other people don't have space and scope to be so casual about it. It feels like a threat to them, so part of what has happened in this dynamic is. And one of the reasons why politics is not going to go back to the way it was before these eruptions is that some of the things that the critics are saying have some validity. I'm right now working on a project that may turn into a book about this whole question of monuments and statues and naming. And it gets more and more complicated. The more you think about it, the more complicated it gets. I keep thinking of something that happened to me. The first time I went to Ukraine, I paid a cab and got some change back. And on the back of one of the notes, there's a picture of a 17th century figure called Khmelnytsky. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sure I'm not. And who turns out, it turns out is a giant hero of Ukrainians, and whom I know because he was the author of the largest massacre of Jewish populations in Europe between the Crusades and the Nazi Holocaust. What? And he's on the money? And so I think, maybe other people have equivalent reactions to that, and that's something I take seriously. So I think it was firing James Bennett at the New York Times was an appalling act of corporate cowardice, and a terrible mistake, and that one that will have consequences for the ability of the New York Times to be a quality paper. But it's not like, and it's something I'm happy to take a stand against, along with other stands that right now seem like the more salient ones.
Yeah, I mean, about the New York Times also, all those New York Times related issues are tough for me because I feel like I don't know the inside story. I'm not inside the New York Times. I don't know exactly what was said by who and so on. So it's but no, I mean, in principle, editors should have some freedom. Need to have freedom to think what they want, and also they should have freedom to make mistakes. I mean, one of the other amusing things about the subject is a couple of years ago when Ian Baruma was fired from the New York Review of Books, in slightly different circumstances. He published an article, although some parallels. He published an article that some staff found offensive. It was an article by a Canadian, I believe, journalist who'd been outed for misogyny and attempted rape and other even worse things. Worse. And Ian Baruma thought it would be interesting to have a piece by someone who had lost their job and so on, and been effectively canceled. Anyway, he doesn't really matter. That's not what happened. Anyway, he was fired for printing that, and I signed a letter, which was, I would say, had an equally illustrious list of names attached to it. People who contribute to the New York Review of Books, literati of all kinds, Harvard professors, poets, and they all signed this letter saying Ian Baruma shouldn't be fired for this reason. And nobody paid the slightest bit of attention to it. It got no notice in the wider press, and it had no impact on the New York Review of Books. So all these grand people, writers and poets and critics. No one cared at all what they said, and they wrote it and it disappeared. And I was really surprised by the reaction to the Harper's letter, that there was this kind of outpouring of interest and emotion and so on about it, because it's not, the language wasn't even that different. And I think some of the names are even the same. And the only conclusion one can have is that, as the politics change, the salience and the nature of the arguments. I mean, this is back to some of the themes of my book. Some of the ideas that seem irrelevant or silly at one point in history or unimportant reemerge later as very important, or factions or groups of people who are right now dominant and in power, later on won't be in power, and vice versa. So, I mean, we all like to think that politics is, you can have sort of unchanging views that will carry you through your lifetime. But actually, as you say, it's a dynamic, and events change, and new information presents itself. I mean, I do think you can have sort of deeper principles. I mean, you can have moral beliefs which don't change. But in terms of picking sides and who are your allies, and what are your views on particular issues, you should be able to change. I mean, absolutely.
Well, let me go back to your American subtitle, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And I remember when you were writing this book, and you would be coming back and forth to teach actually at Johns Hopkins, and we had the just great experience of having you stay with us. And one night we were hashing this over about, you sort of said at the beginning, a taxonomy of why people cotton on to people like Trump and other leaders in the rest of the world. So there's, as you said, the cynicism, which I think we put Tucker Carlson in, the true believers, which we put Laura in. But then, as you say, they underline this. It's this lure of authoritarianism. It is a lure. It's not just identifying politically with someone. It's a real lure that you are seeing sweeping around the world, and that you've captured so wonderfully in basically through friendships and alliances. And what I remember we were talking and saying, like, what is it? What makes someone want? What is the allure of that to even an ordinary person? And then why have you and David been resistant to it? You talked about also having core moral beliefs that kind of guide you as well.
Well, that goes to something that we were talking about just before we talked about the Harper's letter, which is how we assess and judge those of our friends who get caught up in this. And so the part of the allure is ordinary politics. That somebody will say, I strongly believe in something. I strongly want to see judges reverse the Roe v. Wade decision and make abortion no longer a constitutional right. I think that's supreme. I'm prepared to work with some very imperfect instruments in order to get that done. So those people may have not think a lot differently about Donald Trump than you or I or Ann does, but whereas we have a set of issues over here that are so important to us that where he's a threat, they would say, well, he could be useful on the thing I most care about. It's a pragmatic decision. With that, you say, I think you're making even an intellectual error, and I have my own theories about how Trump is not going to serve the causes you believe in, but it doesn't make you a reprehensible person. You're making a prudential decision that is going to turn out to be
I think the
wrong.
Pro-life movement made that decision with Donald Trump.
But I think there's something else that is going on, and this is one of the themes of Ann's book, and this is one of the themes of that discussion. The central fact about Donald Trump is he's a self-pitying bully. He's always screaming at people, and he's always feeling sorry for himself. And I think there are people, especially men, especially men my age who play a lot of golf.
Oh, don't smear the golf players.
But who find this profoundly exciting and liberating. That he allowed we talked at the beginning of this broadcast. We talked about the part of Ontario where we are as a place where a dog can be a dog. I mean, that Donald Trump allows jerks to be jerks, and there are some people who are jerks and who just find him the leader of the jerk liberation movement.
JLL.
and what happens then with those people, even though that you find yourself like looking at somebody and saying, you know, we're not actually having a political disagreement, having a disagreement about something that I find repulsive that you find thrilling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wrote about this a little bit in the cover story that I did for The Atlantic a few weeks ago, which was also about, but this was more to do with, why, again, not so much voters or why people vote for Trump, but again, people who collaborate with him. And one of the explanations, again, is that he, okay, all my life, I've been a straight up and down politician. I felt like I had to say what was right. I was very careful what I said in public. I tried not to, make a mistake on television. Here's Donald Trump. He just says whatever comes into his head. He sleeps with porn stars. He says, anything he wants and he gets away with it. Well, isn't that just great? And you can see the Senate Republicans who long to be liberated from the political straitjacket, saying exactly like that. But I think, Danielle, your original question, which is about the lure of authoritarianism, is actually, this is a very deep question. And there have been a lot of people over the last 100 years who've written about it. And I go into just a tiny bit of that in my book, where I talk about, the person who originally came up with there's a concept of the authoritarian personality. So are there certain types of people who are bothered by democracy, who prefer a single leader, who would rather live in a society without all this arguing, and there have been a lot of theorizing about, is there such a person, and so on. And recently, in the last several years, there's a behavioral psychologist who I quote in the book, who has done a lot of studies and who believes that there is, she calls it not an authoritarian personality, but an authoritarian predisposition. So there's some people who are, who prefer simplicity, and they don't like cacophony and noise, and they dislike clashing politics. And they also, the same kinds of people, by the way, also dislike the arrival of foreigners in their neighborhoods, and they don't like, these are people who are bothered often by demographic change as well as that. But one of the arguments of the book is that there are, people who think like that, are a important constituent of any society rather. So if we call it 20%, there's 20% wherever you go, in the United States, in Spain, in France, in Russia, in China, whatever. And the question is, is there a way to reach those people and to organize them and to give them a voice? And I do think that the tactics that the politics that and new forms of communication that have been made possible by the internet have enabled those kinds of people to find one another. And it's been possible to create sort of new political groupings or identities for people who are bothered by complexity in modern society and want everyone else to just shut up, And, they're actually, you can organize these people into groups, you can make them, give them a political party, you can give them a voice, you can give them new ways to communicate and so on. So there is, and also, by the way, the founding fathers of America, everybody who's ever written about democracy was aware that such a human personality type existed, and that free societies sometimes decline and degenerate and turn into dictatorships. So that was what, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were talking about when they were writing a constitution that had checks and balances and various different systems put in place that were meant to protect the ideals of democracy against the inevitable arrival of a dictator. So they assumed that there would be such a person and that there would be an appeal, that some people would find an authoritarian demagogue appealing. One of the mistakes I think that we've all made in the last 20 or 30 years was to ignore this possibility. In other words, that democracy can decline, that we can elect people who then destroy our institutions, that our institutions can degenerate. We've assumed that because we were so successful, because we won the Cold War, because America's the biggest and most successful democracy in history, we thought it would necessarily go on that way forever. And the book, if it has a moral, if it has a thesis, is that we shouldn't assume that there have always been people who find autocracy appealing. There have always been intellectuals and journalists and spin doctors who seek to reach those kinds of people, including some that we know, and that sometimes these movements win, and that it's our kind of task as modern American citizens to make sure they don't win and to argue back against them, whether they come from the right or the left. Right now, I think the worst challenge is from the right. Possible that in the future it could come from the left, but I just don't. I don't see it yet.
When we think about the future, the accident that this authoritarian type was arrived in the form of a president who was so inattentive, had such a damaged ego, couldn't accept bad news, means that the Trump presidency has presided over this terrible epidemic, and then the collapse of the American economy. And he's on his way to most likely losing very dramatically in November and taking a lot.
But I don't want anyone listening to assume that will happen.
Yes, you keep doing that, and then I have to keep finding wood to stop it.
We have friends who a couple who drive together, and one will goad the other by saying to the other, "I think it's going to be all clear driving from here on." And
nothing could possibly go wrong.
Right. And that's when you hit
no traffic.
That's when you hit the 20-car pileup.
Yes, please.
So I won't.
Ixnay on the predictions.
I won't be Wally with Steve. But supposing that happens, as you say, the 20% are not going to be there, and the future most likely holds that we're going to be in a world in which these tendencies that have discovered their power, that have found new media where they can connect with one another, are going to remain parts of our lives. They may not control executive power in the way that they have done, but they will continue to be political facts and cultural facts. And many of us will discover that people we thought we shared so much with actually, one of the literary documents of our time is a play I remember watching a long time ago. I hesitate to go back to it because I'm not sure it'll stand up, but Eugene Ionesco's Rhinoceros. So this is a play that's set in a seaside town in, I guess, Romania. And everything's going on as normal and people are going about the business. And then suddenly outside the windows of the cafe, a giant rhinoceros goes tootling by. And people are a little startled, but they adjust. And gradually, one by one, the people of the town turn into rhinoceroses until only the town drunk is left. And he's not a rhinoceros and can't understand why he can never be a rhinoceros. What's wrong with him that he can't join it? And this is a metaphor for many things. But so we may be able to repel the rhino invasion, but there are always going to be rhinos among us. And they are going to have seductive power over some personalities.
Yeah, but it's also our job to find ways of reaching those people and finding ways. One of the things I am worried about with the Biden campaign is that it will make the mistake that was just made here by the centrist candidate. That it will spend too much time speaking to its own people. It will fail to find ways of reaching into the opposite echo chamber or filter bubble, whatever you want to call that, and this is why I've written a little bit about recently, and I'm the phenomenon of the Republicans against Trump, who may be who are focused precisely on those people and precisely in that campaign, who are seeking to reach, Trump voters who are maybe disappointed with Trump, or Republicans who feel tribally attached to their party and can't bear the idea of voting for a Democrat. I am hoping that at least these ex-Republicans or anti-Trump Republicans will find ways of reaching them, because it's very tempting to just stay inside your own echo chamber and not reach. I mean, that is a way to lose the election.
All right. Well, and thank you for taking this time with us. I just want people to know that Anne is, even though it's much later in Poland, she's going to stay for a few minutes to answer questions from our subscribers, our supporters at Patreon and Glow. And then we have this whole other monthly podcast where you have asked questions of our guests, and you get to hear it, but only if you subscribe and support the podcast. So thank you, Anne, for agreeing to stay for a few minutes extra. And thank you for joining us. And stay around. We'll have a little bit of listener reaction coming up.